Hi all, hope that you are getting on okay at home, despite everything that's been going on. I hope that you've been able to spend quite a bit of time really just relaxing and reading and enjoying the texts that we have for the literature course, because they are really, really great texts, and they often do really need a ton of time spent on actually just enjoying them. So I hope that you are making the most of this time and sort of allowing yourself to do that. What I want to do today is throw together sort of a little screencast for you that looks at essentially trying to help you write a better essay, thinking about that personal response that you've got to make when you're writing an essay in the exam. But also just considering the elements of theory, because we know that if you include the theory in your responses and in your writing, that you will do better, right? It gives that extra layer, that extra element of sort of criticism and just higher level thinking, really, that we want you to be putting in there, okay? So we're going to look at Keats' poetry. We're going to look at two key ideas from feminist perspectives, okay? Now, if you don't have your anthology, you can find a version of it online. I'll post that link on Show My Homework later today for you in case you haven't got it. But the key ideas are here. You don't really need much more of them than what I've actually put in the video for you, of course. So let's get to it then. So the first one being then, I've underlined and bolded the key important points. We want to think about whose voices are being heard within these poems. And of course, the second side of that being that often when we're looking at literature texts, we consider this idea of male protagonists. But as you'll see in a few minutes, I'm going to argue that oftentimes our protagonists are not actually male, okay? And text often seem to be and are criticized for having these male protagonists, but I personally don't feel that actually that is always the case, especially for these poems, okay? And the second side of this is looking at the different sort of stereotypes that we've got within literature, and the familiar ones, anyhow. So you've got the seductress, the shrew, the helpless, and the angel there. I'm going to debunk these in a few minutes and actually go through, well, what does each one of those mean? Because if you look, it's easy to boil each of those down to a single word, the seductress or the shrew, but there are these additional little caveats to each one of them. So I want to have a look at that with you. And the whole point of this, remember, is just to get you thinking critically and actually looking at something that's there on the face value and then perhaps saying, you know what, let's dig a little bit deeper. I don't think I agree with that or with this. So let's have sort of a first glance at these poems then. You've got these four poems, okay? And based on the bits of theory that I've picked out there, we want to consider questions. You always want to be asking questions, right? So firstly, whose voices are actually heard within these poems, right? Who are the protagonists? Are they male? And are they more significant than the females, right? That's essential too. Now, if you look at each of these, especially the title of them, each of the title focuses on a female character, but often on the surface it seems like sort of that female voice is relegated to the background, and we think more heavily or more in depth about the role of the male characters. But in reality, right, without the females being here, you wouldn't have much within these texts, right? They are central, they are key to these texts, okay? So despite the fact that in, for instance, the Belle Dame Sans Merci, right, largely we're listening to the night story, right? But the night story wouldn't actually work without the voice of the beldam, right? She speaks, he responds, and that's why he's ended up sort of on the cold hillside, right? So even though the poem largely starts in the present, then it's cyclical, right? It moves backwards, we learn about what's happened to him. All of that wouldn't have happened without her voice. So she does have a very, very significant voice, even though he is telling the story. So that's one way of looking at it, okay? Thinking about the protagonists too, well, who are they? Are they male? Are they female? I'm going to suggest that in many instances, actually, the protagonists in these poems are largely female, right? The key characters are actually largely female. And we want to sort of consider, well, actually, well, what does it mean to be a protagonist? What does it mean to be a significant character? Who, if you will, is the driving force within each of the poems, okay? Then from there, okay, are any of those characters, if we do consider them to be a protagonist, right, a main character, the key character to a story, if you will, what sort of stereotypes do they fall within? Are they a seductress? Are they a shrew? Are they helpless? Or are they this angel character, this angelic character, rather? Okay? So, right, please remember that when we're working as a feminist critic, we're examining and we're possibly disputing this idea that they fall into the stereotype. And we can also dispute the idea that the stereotype really matters, that actually, no, you know what? These are perhaps little bits of each character, but they don't specifically fall under those parameters, and we've got to consider the different ways in which those might apply, right? How else can we view these characters? That's key as well, okay? So the first bit, we're thinking about voices, we're thinking about male protagonists, okay? If we look at Lamia, right, is she the protagonist? I mean, the title suggests that she is. And what about Lysias? We seem to read an awful lot about him. He's key to the story. I won't deny that at all. But she's so central to this, right? She sets up this entire encounter with her. So actually, I could argue that she is really very, very key. She is the protagonist. She sets everything in motion. Lysias is perhaps just a victim of circumstance, right? However, her voice eventually is ignored, right? She doesn't want this big celebration of their love. She wants nothing to do with it, actually. And as a result of that, right, it seems to become incredibly problematic, right? So we really want to think very carefully, if you will, about how that voice is actually heard, okay? Does that lead us to one of those stereotypical representations that I've mentioned there, okay? In La Belle Dame, again, the title suggests she's the protagonist. She's the key character. It's the knight's point of view. It's completely centered on her, right? Her voice does seem to be heard, though, right? She speaks, he seems to respond, and that really consumes him and everything that he does there forward, right? So do we end up with one of those stereotypical representations, something for you to consider? Going to the Eve of St. Agnes, Madeline seems to be the central figure in the poem, right? We're first told that Porphyro is young, right? He's referred to as young Porphyro. So actually, is he kind of irrelevant? Is the poem all about her and what she wants and what she desires and what she hopes to gain? Is that really what it's about? And actually, is she empowered because of that, right? She speaks, she demands to him, he melts into her dream, right? And not the other way around. So it does seem like actually she's somewhat in charge. Her voice is really the crucial one. What she wants, what she desires is the key element to that, right? And actually, in that sense, she can be the protagonist, and he's sort of just a secondary character, really, in relation to that. We know they leave together, so it seems like they've gained some type of equality, if you will, but actually, she really sets all these things in motion, and I think you can make that argument that she's much more significant, okay? In Isabella, right, her voice I don't think is heard at any point in time, right? Everything that she wants is largely pushed to the side. It's ignored, right? The brothers act, okay? But then she acts as well, so she isn't actually heard, but what she does causes massive change, right? Her actions cause Lorenzo to fall and fail, her involvement causes Lorenzo to, essentially leads him to his death, right? By the same token, when she chooses to act and actually goes and retrieves him or retrieves his head, right, and brings it back, eventually her brothers are forced away to flee and lose everything. They were typically, these very powerful male characters, but actually it seems that she's got power on her own in her own way, right? And that is something that we want to question, actually. What is the extent of that power? Even though she seems to be silent, she maybe seems quite passive. Actually, does she have a much more aggressive role, if you will, than we first think, okay? So think about those male characters too, right? Are there stereotypical representations of them as well? Could you debunk the men into certain categories, and the male characters into certain categories? We also want to critique them. How can they be viewed? Are they just looking to take advantage? Do they underestimate the power? Maybe is that a key attribute to a typical male character, that they're going to underestimate the females? Okay, so something else for you to consider then. Right, I want to look at the four different, from the theory there, I want to look at the four different sort of stereotypical women or female characters. And I'm going to go through each one of them in turn with a dictionary definition for a key element of each of these, okay? So how do we interpret them? And I want you to always consider that word that's at the bottom of the bubble in the middle there, but. The but is so important, right? They might appear on the surface to be this, but is that it? Is that all that's there, right? Many of these, or each of these rather, has got a layer to them. And I want you to consider the entirety of that layer. What does that actually mean? Okay, so in the first instance, we've got a seductress, particularly someone who might seduces someone, might entice someone with sexual activity. Okay, do the male characters have an allure as well? Right? Think about Lysias. Lamia seems incredibly attracted and allured by him, almost seduced by the idea of him. So actually, is that just a female characteristic? Also, think about the idea of her being immoral. Think about the idea of her being dangerous, perhaps. That really sort of depends on, well, what is your definition of morality? What do you feel is immoral? She deliberately lays a trap for Lysias. She wants to catch him out, if you will, in a way. She wants to find him. She wants to ensnare him. Is that immoral? Right? Or is she just trying to fall in love? Because actually, if you think she's just trying to fall in love and going to any extent for love, then maybe that isn't immoral. So we have to consider that. Okay. Next, you've got the eternally dissatisfied shrew, which is a bad temper or aggressively assertive woman. Okay. Again, by a dictionary definition, aggressively assertive woman, that's got another side to it, doesn't it? That actually, if someone's aggressively assertive, that often means that they're empowered, right? They're taking what they want because they want it, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad-tempered, but actually it could mean that, they're reclaiming, if you will, their femininity, their female role, and actually saying, you know what, no, I'm not taking this lying down. I am a powerful character, and perhaps that goes against much of what we think, right? So we have to consider how that actually comes into play within these poems, okay? Next, you've got the unworldly, self-sacrificing angel, a person of exemplary conduct or virtue in terms of being an angel, right? You've got the religious connotations, of course, as well, but I do want us to just think about, well, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be angelic, right? Is Madeline angelic, right? Does she have exemplary conduct and virtue? Does that conduct and virtue, does she actually do anything that's impure? She desires a husband. She goes about the ritual. She follows this sort of religious path, or tries to anyway, and he interferes. Is that religiosity? Is that sort of goodness? Is that sacrificed because she's trying to fill this expectation that seems to exist for her? Right, so we've got to think about that as well. The idea of sacrifice too. I mean, we can see that in Isabella too, right? Does she sacrifice her health, her well-being for true love? She's willing to do anything for it. She's willing to die for it, right? She's willing to go to absolutely any extent. She doesn't care what society expects of her, what her brothers expect of her. Obviously, there are other consequences, but does that elevate her to this angelic figure? So we want to think about it like that, okay? Then finally, this idea of being cute but essentially helpless. Helpless meaning being unable to defend oneself or to act without help. It's interesting to note here as well, okay, that helpless can also mean troublesome, right, or out of control. So are any of these characters, is Lamia out of control, right? This cute but essentially helpless character, is that Madeline, right? Within that poem, is she that character who is sort of helpless? She feels like she's bound to do this, and whatever happens as a result of it. And by that, is she a victim in that sense, or is she being assertive? Is she uncontrollable in the sense that she's willing to let this ritual happen, and whatever happens from it, she's willing to go with it? Is that actually her being empowered? Is that her being aggressive, perhaps, actually, and claiming what she wants? Right? So remember that each of these is a character. They're characterized. Keats writes them deliberately in this way. Is he trying to tell us something about male characters and female characters? And we have to think about that. We've got to critique them. We want to actually see, well, is just what's on the surface present there? Okay? And the final bit of this that I'll leave you with is an exam style question, which is, in tragedy, female characters are often villains cloaked as victims. So I want you to take some of the ideas that I've shared with you here today and consider them in relation to Death of a Salesman as well as the Keats. I've not touched on Death of a Salesman. I'll do that in a future video. But thinking about the ideas that are right in front of you here and what I've pointed out in different bits and the questions that I've asked, actually, can you think of anything that perhaps maybe changes your interpretation of the poems? Are they as clear-cut as you think they are? That's the point of this, again, getting you to think about that personal response and the way that you react to these. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to reading your work.